All right, you're going to learn about deponent verbs this week, and this might feel difficult, but I promise you that it isn't. The word deponent comes from the verb deponere, which means to put down. So these verbs literally have put down their active forms. Now, deponent verbs appear passive in Latin, but they translate as active in English. The trick is to be able to recognize them in Latin. So deponent verbs are recognized by their three principal parts. And they only have three principal parts, and they are literally the normal first, second, and, well, the first, second, not the third that you know, but the fourth principal part. Now, the first principal part of deponent verb always ends in OR. You can see it here. Always right here. So they have, what I want you to do is take a look at your vocabulary really quick. Chapter 26, look at your vocabulary list. You see all the verbs that have only three parts. And as well, I have a lot of this in your chart book. So if you take a look on deponent verbs on your chart book, there's a reference sheet that'll help you later. Now, just like with regular verbs, there are 4 conjugations for deponent verbs. As with regular verbs, you know which conjugation a verb is by its infinitive, what we call this the second. So here's the first principal part, here's the second principal part, and I call this the third principal part. It is actually the fourth, but I call it the third because it's just listed third here. Okay, so the first principal part, we already know, ends in OR. The second principal part, it looks like an infinitive, but just not the ones you're used to. It's actually the form of the infinitive you've just learned. It's a passive infinitive. So the second principal part is simply the passive infinitive. Now, the third principal part, or the third one listed, is the perfect passive participle, which you know already, plus a form of sum. So to find the stem, you go to the second principal part, just like you normally do, and you're going to remove the RI. And I've listed a bunch of stems here for you so you can get the idea. Now, for third conjugation verbs, all you need to do is to drop the I on the end and add an E instead. So one other hint that may help you recognize deponent verb is that passive verbs, because you're going to think these are passive verbs at first rather than deponent verbs because that's what you're used to. If you see a passive verb with an accusative, that's a clue you can be dealing with a deponent verb instead, because passive verbs cannot take an accusative. Remember, we always say that passive verbs are something that you can add to, I was eaten by zombies. It doesn't take the accusative, right? It takes the ablative form. So that's one hint that you may be dealing with a deponent verb instead of simply a passive verb. All right, let's look at a couple of sentences here. All right, sororem meum admirabar. So here we go. It looks like a passive verb. We know because you looked in the dictionary and the first principal part end in OR that it is a deponent verb, and it gets translated active. It is in the imperfect passive because look, it's got the bar on it. So it's imperfect passive, but remember we have to translate it as active. Right? So I was admiring my sister. All right, next one. Me seque mini. It also looks like passive. We know that it's a deponent verb. So it's a future, because of the mini, its future gets translated as an active. You will follow me. Is haec mala fortiter passus est. Again, we see that third principal part there. But it's perfect passive. Remember, it's perfect passive, but it's translated active. So he suffered these evils bravely. He's not suffered by. He suffered these evils bravely. Last one. Caesar viro sine loquitur. All right. It is the present, because it's got a ter ending on it, a present passive translated active. Caesar speaks to the old man. All right, so deponent verbs, they do have participles, and they're formed in the same way as for normal verbs. All right. However, they do, remember we said they look passive, but they're translated active. We actually do have some active forms So some that appear active and gets translated active are the present participle, the future participle, and the future infinitive. That's just kind of a rule that you need to keep in mind. All right, so I've added some other examples of imperative, infinitive, and participles to your chart book for reference. So take some time to look at those on page 25. You'll probably need them for homework and for later. All right. Let's talk about deponent verbs with the ablative case. So you've learned that there are some verbs referred to as special intransitive that take an object in the dative case. Remember that? Dative of agent, that kind of thing. Now there are some deponent verbs that take an ablative as an object, right? And I've listed them here. These are ones you are just going to have to learn to recognize and even memorize. Okay, example is now non audent uti navibus. They do not dare to use the ships. So here we have the deponent verb. It's in present, right? Deponent verb, and here we have it takes an ablative plural object. Pretty simple. Just know that's why the ablative is going to show up, and especially if you're looking at those verbs. All right, now we've just talked about deponent verbs. We're going to talk about ones called semi-deponent, which means part of them, right? There's a small group of verbs called semi-deponent. Like deponent verbs, they only have 3 principal parts. And deponent verbs are passive in all forms. However, semi-deponents, the first 2 principal parts are active. They look active and they get translated as active. The last principal part, which is the perfect tense. Remember before the first one was the perfect, remember the sum, right? The sum was the perfect passive participle plus sum is the third principal part. Here the third principal part is perfect. The third principal part is perfect. It is not the normal fourth principal part, perfect passive participle. Okay, so the last principal part is passive in Latin, but translates as active, right? Again, first 2 principal parts are active. It's semi. That's the regular part of it. The last principal part, the perfect tense, is passive in Latin, but translates as active in English. It does not have a perfect passive participle. All right, you have 2 semi-deponent verbs in your vocabulary. Notice that they also just have 3 principal parts, but the first principal part does not end in OR. So that's the difference between a deponent and a semi-deponent verb, and that's how you're going to be able to recognize them. So literally, audio, that is just regular. It means I dare. Audere, it means to dare, and that is the infinitive. It's the regular infinitive. Here's the one that's the deponent part. Aususum. So it has a perfect translation, a perfect tense translation, right? But it kind of almost looks like a little bit perfect past, right? It looks like a participle, but it's not. Or it looks like a different kind of verb, but it's actually the perfect. All right. The next one is gaudio, so normal first part, I rejoice. Gaudere, normal infinitive. Third principal part, which again is the perfect tense. And remember, perfect first singular is what we find in that, and that's regular. I rejoiced. All right, let's look at a couple of examples. So I'm going to first give it to you using the second principal part, so in a tense that's not perfect, and then I'm going to show you how it changes when we turn it into perfect. So, contra coniculo salvissimos pugnare audes. So here it is, just a normal you dare, right? Second singular present tense. You dare to fight against the very ferocious rabbits. Now I'm going to put it in perfect tense, and it's going to look like it's passive, but it's not. Contra caniculos salvissimos pugnare ausus est. And it gets translated active as the very regular perfect. You dared to fight against the very ferocious rabbits. All right, let's take a look at another one. Rex muros densos castilli videre gaudibit. So totally normal, future tense, verb, gaudibit. The king will rejoice to see the thick walls of the castle. All right, now let's put it in perfect tense. And we've got that thing that looks like passive, yes, but we're going to make it active when we translate it. So this is, I'm going to label these. This is perfect. And so it uses the third, right? So it uses the third principal part, but not the regular perfect endings. Again, perfect uses the third principal part, but does not use the regular perfect endings. So the king rejoiced to see the thick walls of the castle. So you know, look at this. It uses the, right? It uses a form of the present to be, even though it's perfect. And once you break down all those little parts, it's actually pretty easy. You just have to recognize what kind of verb it is and then translate it as you've been taught here.